A woman was driving down a pitch-black silent road when suddenly, in her rearview mirror, she saw a car speeding towards her. A series of terrifying images flashed through her mind. Fortunately, the car quickly sped past and disappeared into the darkness. But before she could breathe a sigh of relief, the woman was horrified to see the car suddenly stop in the middle of the road. At this point, she completely lost her composure. She slammed on the gas pedal, rushing to the nearest gas station. But because it was late at night, the place was deserted. As the woman desperately cried for help, the car stopped right behind her. Then, a dark figure got out of the car, seemingly intending to harm her. The woman was so terrified that she didn't dare linger. She scrambled into the deserted field ahead. Luckily, a truck appeared just in time. She rushed out to block it with all her might, then collapsed to the ground like a person possessed. But what she didn't know was that the real danger had only just begun. Joe Deacon was a patrol officer in a small California town. Normally, he handled minor, insignificant matters. That day, he had just returned to the police station when he was suddenly called back by his superior and ordered to go to Los Angeles to retrieve evidence from a robbery case. This made his already dull life even more frustrating. But the police station was short of staff, so he could only suppress his anger and drive to Los Angeles alone. Upon arrival, he was informed that he needed his superior's signature to retrieve the evidence. Helpless, he had no choice but to leave. But as he stepped out the door, he saw his car about to be towed away. Beside him stood an arrogant, self-satisfied man. This man completely disregarded Deep, a police officer from the countryside. That arrogant attitude infuriated Deep, but he had no other choice but to go and plead with the police chief. Unexpectedly, upon entering the police station, he discovered the man from earlier was holding a press conference. It turned out the man's name was Jim, a rising detective who was attracting considerable attention. He was in charge of investigating a recent series of murders. However, Deke wasn't interested in that. He only wanted to know when he could take the evidence. Chief Carl seemed quite familiar with Deke. When Carl saw Deke, he appeared somewhat disbelieving. Nevertheless, he insisted that the evidence needed to be re-examined. At the earliest, Deke wouldn't be able to retrieve it until tomorrow. These repeated obstacles completely eroded Deke's patience. He turned to leave when he unexpectedly encountered a former colleague. Deke had worked at the Los Angeles Police Department, but 5 years ago, for some unknown reason, he had been transferred to a remote town. Seeing his colleagues rise through the ranks filled him with mixed emotions, both bitterness and resentment. Jim was speaking enthusiastically to the crowd, which made Deke feel like he was seeing his old self. While Deke was paying attention to Jim also became curious about this mysterious man. After learning that he was the legendary detective Deke, Jim's interest immediately surged. Jim proactively approached Deke and invited him to the crime scene to give him some guidance. This was the fourth murder in nearly 2 months. The victims were all young, single women. Inside the house, a foul stench filled the air, and blood was splattered everywhere. The victims' bodies were naked, covered in fatal wounds, and their heads were wrapped in garbage bags. This was enough to show that the killer was a cruel and vicious psychopath. Just as Deke was investigating the crime scene, he unexpectedly encountered his former forensic friend, Flo. Flo was also surprised to see Deke. After a few words of conversation, Deke thoughtfully examined the bodies. He just felt that this case was very similar to the cases he had handled before. Next, he turned and looked out the window. A sudden realization struck him. Without a word, Deke went alone to the storage room opposite the apartment. Sure enough, he found an overturned chair on the floor, and when he pulled back the window curtains, he could see the entire crime scene. Deke understood that the killer must have been sitting there, witnessing the victims' deaths to satisfy their sick obsession. That familiar scene plunged Deke into a whirlwind of memories. 5 years ago, he had received a report of a murder. 2 young girls had also been murdered using a similar method. To this day, the killer had not been caught. This had become the biggest shadow in Deke's heart. Later, the victim's identity was confirmed as a woman named Julie. Jim hastily ordered an investigation into Julie's network of connections. At the same time, he greatly admired Deke's keen intuition and wanted his help in investigating and solving the case. But early the next morning, Deke unexpectedly received a call from his superior, informing him that the robber had confessed and no further evidence was needed. Deke had to return quickly. Seeing Deke about to leave, Jim hastily dropped a bombshell. They had apprehended the suspect in the serial murder case. This statement successfully captured Deke's attention, prompting him to decide to participate in the interrogation. He frowned, looking through the one-way glass at tense suspect. Jim pulled out photos of the female victims and carefully observed the changes in his face. Seeing the suspect repeatedly deny everything, Deke picked up the phone and said a name to Jim: Mary. Surprisingly, after hearing that name, the suspect's expression changed drastically, as if he had understood something. He stood stunned in front of the glass. After the interrogation ended, Deke revealed the mystery. Mary was one of the victims of the crime 5 years earlier. This suspect had also been questioned questioned by Deacon. Although the other party was despicable, their timid nature didn't resemble that of a serial killer. After saying that, Deacon lost interest. He drove back to town. On the way, he unexpectedly saw a girl sitting in a car. That bright, radiant smile brought back old memories. Deacon's heart was in turmoil. Finally, he decided to stay in Los Angeles to investigate the case. He wanted to protect that beautiful smile. He wanted to resolve the knot in his heart that had been there for years. Deacon sought out Flo at the autopsy room. He learned that the killer had placed garbage bags over the victims' heads after they died. From that, he deduced that the victims likely knew the killer. However, he didn't care about that now. He only asked Flo to retrieve a case file from 5 years ago. She understood what he wanted immediately, but she didn't refuse. She only warned him that if problems arose again, she wouldn't help him anymore. Clearly, there was a secret between the two of them that no one else knew. After saying goodbye to Flo, Deacon returned to the crime scene alone. From the homeowner, he learned that the refrigerator in the house had broken down a week earlier, and she had called an appliance repairman to fix it. This gave Deacon a glimmer of hope. Since there were no signs of forced entry, it was highly possible that the repairman was the culprit. He also asked the homeowner to retrieve the beer cans from the refrigerator as evidence. After completing his preliminary investigation, Deacon rented a room in a dilapidated motel. He pasted documents about the case from 5 years ago on the wall. In his daze, he seemed to see the 3 female victims standing in the room. They had become a nightmare that tormented Deacon's mind incessantly. The next day, the police chief called Jim to his office and told him that the suspect questioned the previous night had done something reckless. Then, he sternly warned Jim not to get too close to Deacon. Years ago, it was Deacon's overly extreme approach to solving the case that had driven him to madness. He suffered a heart attack and nearly lost his life. Although he ultimately survived, it shattered his family. Jim's secretive life allowed him to retreat to a small town to work as a patrol officer. The police chief didn't want Jim to follow in Deacon's footsteps, recognizing the many similarities between the two. However, the chief was unaware that Deacon had taken leave from his superiors to stay in Los Angeles and dedicate himself entirely to solving the case. He went to the electronics store the motel owner had mentioned, presented his identification, and recorded the information of all the employees. But as Deacon turned to leave, he was unaware that a long-haired man was silently peeking from behind a curtain, watching his retreating figure with a pensive expression. At the same time, Jim noticed a missing person notice posted on the police station's bulletin board. A girl named Lang had disappeared on the same night Julie's body was discovered. Jim's intuition told him there was a connection between the two cases, so he went to Lange's parents to inquire about the situation. Before Lange disappeared, she was wearing a red hair clip. Jim kept this clue in mind and was determined to find it no matter what. However, before the storm could subside, another one arose. That evening, Jim received a report that a body had been found submerged in the river. He rushed to the scene, trying to suppress his nausea. He pulled out the body bag and compared the photos. He discovered that the victim was not Long. This brought him a sigh of relief. It seemed there was still a chance to save Long. Looking up, he was surprised to see Deacon standing before him with a forced smile. Deacon handed Jim a list of the electronics store's employees and reminded him that killer was likely among them. After Jim expressed his gratitude, he took the opportunity to ask a question that had been bothering him for a long time. Deacon, once a legendary detective with the highest success rate in the Los Angeles Police Department, why hadn't he been promoted in 15 years? This remark brought a hint of bitterness to Deacon's eyes, but he didn't explain. Jim understood that there was definitely a secret Deacon didn't want to talk about, so Jim didn't ask any more questions and invited Deacon home for breakfast. During the meal, Jim's wife and daughter appeared one after another. The image of a happy family filled Deacon with admiration and simultaneously ignited a longing in his heart. He mustered up the courage to go to his ex-wife's house. Although everything seemed unchanged, a thick glass barrier separated them, forever maintaining an unbridgeable distance. His ex-wife had remarried and had 2 daughters. She understood the pain and changes he had endured, but they couldn't go back to how things used to be. After several attempts to speak but holding back, they could only sadly part ways. That night, Jim found Deacon at a bar and told him that, along with the body found in the river, a total of 6 people had been brutally murdered. But strangely, the crime scenes were very far apart. This seemed unusual, but Jim didn't see it that way. He argued that the killer must have at least 2 cars and frequently drove around aimlessly to choose targets. That's why the crime scenes were different. This argument successfully dispelled Jim's doubts. He then brought up another issue. Why was Deacon investigating the mysterious case that had been frozen for 5 years? Hearing this, Deacon led Jim to the crime scene from years ago and said that when he arrived, he found 2 bodies lying face down on a rock. A third body was lying not far away, as if they were having a deadly afternoon Deacon had poured his heart into solving the case, but ultimately he hadn't found anything. He felt he had had let the deceased down, leaving them with regrets. That's why he abandoned everything to investigate and solve the case. He only wanted to catch the killer to resolve the knot in his heart that had weighed on him for so many years. With Deke's honesty, Jim completely acknowledged and respected this legendary police officer. Jim decided to cooperate with Deke in the investigation. So when Deke got out of the car, he immediately provided Jim with information about the electronics store employees. Among them, a man named Albeck had a criminal record and lived near Hollywood. Clearly, he was the most likely suspect. Deke didn't stop. He immediately went to Albeck's house and found him preparing to sell a car. Just as Deke pulled out his flashlight to check, Albeck unexpectedly came out carrying trash. It was the long-haired man from the electronics store. Deke quickly hid behind the blinding light and began questioning Albeck. Albeck didn't flinch. He calmly answered all the questions. But when Albeck saw Deke's face clearly, he became aggressive. Albeck pointed his finger at Deke as if to say they had met before. This reaction only strengthened Deke's suspicions. When Albeck went upstairs, Deke hurriedly took the trash bag back to his motel. He emptied everything out and discovered beer cans identical to those at Julie's house. Deke was instantly thrilled. He hastily gave the half-eaten slice of pizza Albeck had eaten to Flo for testing. The results showed some resemblance to the teeth marks on the body, but they couldn't be completely certain. However, for Deke, that was more than enough. The next day, he rented a car from a rental company and waited outside Albeck's house. They discovered that his life was extremely regular. Outside of work, he just hung around nightclubs. According to Deke, this was entirely his process of choosing his prey. On the second day, Deke followed Albeck as he drove onto the highway. Just as Deke was excitedly watching, Albeck suddenly stopped by the side of the road, giving him no time to react. He could only pretend nothing had happened and continue driving straight ahead. Only after driving a considerable distance did he dare to stop. Then, Deke took a large detour to the opposite side of Albeck's house. But what he didn't expect was that Albeck would start his car and stop right beside him. Albeck even looked provocative and raised his finger again. When Albeck drove away, Deke was stunned to realize this was where the second body had been discovered. He quickly contacted Jim and learned that the police had never released this detail. So how did Albeck know? At this point, his suspicion of Albeck grew rapidly. Simultaneously, the police discovered that Albeck had abandoned a car 2 weeks prior. With more and more clues pointing towards Albeck, Jim couldn't sit still. Jim immediately ordered Albeck's arrest. But Albeck wasn't surprised at all. It seemed he had anticipated this, so he obediently allowed himself to be taken to the police station. At the station, there was also the person who reported the crime, the woman who had fled that night. After Jim questioned him briefly, he instructed his subordinates to keep an eye on her while Albeck arrived to identify the killer. However, the subordinates carelessly allowed the woman to see Albeck exit the elevator prematurely. As soon as Albeck was taken into the interrogation room, Deke remained behind the glass as usual. Meanwhile, Jim presented all the photos of the victims. Albeck seemed to be thoroughly enjoying the situation. A mocking expression appeared on his face as he said, "The police basically had no evidence. Otherwise, the interrogation wouldn't have unfolded this way." Seeing this, Deke asserted that Albeck was the culprit. He stormed into the interrogation room, loudly demanding to know why he killed the women. Seeing Deke losing control, Jim quickly pulled him away to prevent the situation from escalating. But Albeck, at the center of the storm, maintained a calm demeanor, seemingly having anticipated this. After the interrogation ended, Jim showed the woman some photos for identification. She glanced at them, pointed directly at Albeck, and declared him the murderer. But then she said she had seen the man earlier. This statement enraged Jim because the woman had seen Albeck before the deadline. Therefore, according to regulations, her testimony was legally invalid. To make matters worse, the police chief saw Jim getting more and more involved, so he decided to invite the FBI to investigate. They will hand over the entire case next Monday. Meanwhile, the police chief also told Jim that Albeck had been arrested for murder 8 years ago. He had cooperated fully and proactively confessed, wasting 10 hours of their time. They eventually discovered he had a perfect alibi. Therefore, Albeck was a deranged man with a deep understanding of the law. His favorite thing to do was manipulate police. Jim knew he had encountered an extremely difficult opponent, but having come this far, how could he just give up? There were only 2 days left until Monday. Jim decided to seize the opportunity to solve the case. He went to Deke and explained his purpose. Deke also showed a smug smile because he had already realized that Jim was just like him. If they didn't achieve their goal, they swore they wouldn't give up. The two immediately hit it off and decided to take a risky gamble. Jim used a public phone to contact Albeck, pretending to apologize for what had happened earlier in the day and arranging to meet him at a nearby bar. Deke waited for Albeck to leave before quietly sneaking into Albeck's house. He found familiar cans of beer in the refrigerator and a broken pointed knife. Just as Deke was examining them, a sudden announcement blared. Albeck had connected to the police communication channel. criminal. Deke tried to remain calm and continued his search. He found numerous videotapes and law books. He saw 3 teeth from a cup in the bathroom, but these things didn't prove anything. Deke was about to leave when he suddenly discovered a hollow floor beneath his feet. He pulled back the rug and saw a secret compartment. Inside were all the newspaper articles about the case, including those of the 3 victims from 5 years ago. Deke was momentarily terrified, but at that very moment, a sudden change occurred. The police communication channel unexpectedly blared an emergency announcement. The address was Albeck's apartment. It turned out that Albeck had gone to the bar and not found Jim, so he realized something was amiss. He borrowed the restaurant's landline phone to call the police. The police arrived very quickly and cordoned off the entire area. Jim tried to stall for time, but since this wasn't his territory, he was stopped outside. Fortunately, Deke calmly climbed onto the roof and quietly escaped. This relieved Jim. However, when Jim turned around, he found Albeck looking at him with a smug expression. His throat tightened, realizing this man was far more difficult to deal with than he had imagined. Jim caught up with the fleeing Deke and asked if he had seen Lanya's red hair clip, but in that situation, Deke didn't have time to pay attention to such things. Unwilling to give up, the two continued to guard Albeck's house the next day. During this time, Jim received new information. After the murder 5 years earlier, Albeck had left the area and only recently returned. This further increased suspicion against him, but Albeck realized he was being followed, so he drove around aimlessly all day. This exhausted Jim and Deke, leaving them both completely worn out. Seeing that Jim was about to lose his temper, Deke decided to go buy a cup of coffee to stay awake. But just as he left, public telephone on the side of the road suddenly rang. Jim, full of suspicion, picked it up. Unexpectedly, he found Albeck right behind him. Albeck's mocking smile made Jim unable to restrain himself any longer. Jim pulled out his gun, held Albeck at gunpoint, and used a photo to force him to reveal Lange's whereabouts. However, what Jim didn't expect was that this time Albeck not only didn't avoid him, but he also wanted to lead Jim to find Lange. Seeing Albeck's mysterious behavior, Jim was very hesitant, but because he was so eager to solve the case, he finally got into the car. Deacon, who had just stepped out of the convenience store, saw this scene. He quickly threw away his coffee cup, started his car, and chased after them. But on the way, he was stopped by a red light. Deacon had to rely on his intuition to remember Albeck's direction and continue his search. Not long after, Albeck drove to a farm. Albeck told Jim to unlock the iron gate and stop at an open field. Albeck hinted that Lange was buried there. Jim took the shovel and without hesitation, filled with hope, began digging. But every time they dug halfway, Albeck would say he was mistaken, that it should be somewhere else. Jim could only change direction like a machine, continuing to dig, despite exhaustion. What angered Jim even more was Albeck suddenly saying he wasn't the killer and that no one was buried there. But things had come to this point. If Jim gave up, it would be a complete farce. Jim could only continue digging one hole after another. Albeck understood that Jim had fallen into his trap, and he was momentarily triumphant. Albeck even mentioned Jim's family, saying that Jim couldn't protect them, just as he couldn't protect the female victims. Jim, already angry from digging, completely lost control upon hearing Albeck's words. Without thinking, he swung the shovel and struck Albeck hard. By the time Jim came to his senses, Albeck was lying motionless on the ground. At this point, Jim was shocked and panicked. He couldn't believe he had become a murderer. Just as Jim was in a state of panic, Deke finally arrived in his car. The moment Deke saw Albeck's body, he immediately understood what had happened. At the same time, deeply buried memories resurfaced. It turned out that 5 years ago, there were actually only 2 victims. The third was accidentally killed by Deke while investigating the crime scene. By the time the other police officers discovered it, it was too late. Ultimately, for the sake of the police department's reputation, they had Flo falsify the autopsy results and falsely claim that all 3 girls had been murdered by the killer. Although Deke escaped legal punishment, he couldn't go against his conscience. He fell into a deep abyss of self-reproach and endless guilt. He could only go to a small town and work as a patrol officer. Seeing Jim's panic, Deke completely understood his feelings. Therefore, Deke didn't say another word, only telling Jim to quickly bury Albeck. Meanwhile, Deke drove Albeck's car back to the city, cleaned up and destroyed all the belongings in his house, and then gave the car to some thugs. By the time Deke returned to the farm, it was already morning. Deke helped Jim fill in all the holes and told him to take 2 weeks off to calm down. Deke also had to return to town. From now on, no one should mention Albeck's name again. After saying this, the two hugged and parted ways. Meanwhile, the FBI had arrived in Los Angeles. They suspected the killer was a white man with an extremely high IQ, most likely working in engineering. But these things no longer concerned Jim. He sat at home, distraught and still consumed by endless remorse. Unexpectedly, Jim received a letter from Deke. Inside were a note advising him not to be an angel and a red hair clip. Jim held the hair clip in his hand. The self-reproach in his heart gradually faded. He understood that the person he killed child was not innocent. But was that really the truth? Deke returned to town and dumped all of Anbeck's belongings into a barrel and burned them. Then, with a complicated expression, he threw in a bunch of newly purchased hair clips, but the red one inside was gone. Everything seemed to have calmed down. Today's movie ends here. Thank you for watching. What did you think of this movie? Please comment below. Goodbye, and see you again.